To the Minnesota Stormwater Seminar Series. I am John Gulliver, and I will introduce this series and our speaker today. This series is co-sponsored by the Water Resources Center and the St. Anthony Falls Laboratory, both at the University of Minnesota, and funded by the Stormwater Research Council, which is also from Minnesota. Our speaker today is Aditi Bhaskar, who is an associate professor in the Department of Civil, Architectural and Environmental Engineering at the University of Colorado, Boulder. Aditi received a combined Bachelor of Science degree in Geology, Physics, and Math from Brown University and a PhD in Environmental Engineering from the University of Maryland, Baltimore, where she worked with Professor Claire Welty. She was a National Science Foundation postdoctoral fellow before joining Colorado State University and then CU Boulder. Aditi specializes in changes to water research and water resources that accompany urban development, such as the interactions between streams, groundwater, stormwater, and urban irrigation. Much of her service is focused on justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. She's also the recipient of a National Science Foundation Career Award. So today, Aditi is going to be talking about placement of green infrastructure in watersheds, I think. So please join me in welcoming Aditi Bhaskar.
Thank you, John, and it's been great to be here and learn from interacting with some of you already, and looking forward to continuing to interact and, lots to learn about what's going on in Minnesota. And I'm going to be sharing some work about stormwater control measure selection and watershed scale effectiveness. And so I'm going to be using this term, stormwater control measures, or SCMs, which is sometimes called best management practices, or BMPs. And let's see if this is clicking. Okay, so yeah, I'm going to talk about two topics. The first one is about patterns in SCM implementation across cities, and the second one is thinking then about how successful are these, how effective are they at a watershed scale. Okay, so this is work that was carried out by a former PhD student, Ben Choate, and him and others collected SCM inventory data from 23 cities, in different places in the US. And this was collecting information on what types of SCMs are implemented and the number. We weren't really getting into all the other characteristics of the SCMs about, how big are they? How much do they cost? Where are they located? Just the number and the type. And we wanted to analyze across cities. And this proved to be more challenging than we ever expected, because there are so many different names used for those SCMs across cities. There's not a standardized terminology used for SCMs. And so we found 290 terms describing these SCMs. So cities on, stormwater is locally managed and named. And so cities are using different terms to describe their SCMs, which makes it difficult to say what this city is using is similar or different than another city. So first we looked at our cities using, across the US, using comparable nomenclature. We found there's not a lot of sharing of nomenclature or naming. The exception was Tucson and Phoenix used similar naming, but all the other cities had a lot of different nomenclature. And the most commonly used terms or names were rain garden, with 9 cities out of the 23 using those that in their SCM inventory. And then 8 cities also used bioretention, green roof, and unknown was actually one of the most common terms in the inventory. And so we put out this article, we thought about how to facilitate sharing of SCM data across cities for future work. And I understand there may be some interest in contributing some Minnesota data here. And so we put out this article to share, well, we're not coming to a standardized nomenclature because cities are using such different terms, but to share information about what the functions are behind those SEMs. So we classified all of these SEMs into some kind of standardization by looking at if that term was not clear what was referred to. We looked back at the design manual of that city and saw what is this, what is the function of this, so we can try and classify it. And so that information being shared by cities would help inform the sharing across cities of SCM data. So within these cities, we also looked at some information about what SCMs were present. So we're looking at the 23 cities and then the density of SCMs on the y-axis here. So the total number of SCMs per impervious area. And we saw, and these are color coded by whether they're MS4 phase 1 or 2, and also whether they have combined sewers. And so we saw MS4 phase 1 cities also with combined sewers had the greatest density of SCMs. And we also saw a really wide range in the density of SCMs, less than 1 per square mile of impervious area to over 500. And, we couldn't get in this sharing, in this database, we couldn't get into the size, but obviously you would expect the SCM size and treatment area to vary, but just the number is also extremely variable. Okay, at the bottom here is the classification that we put all those terms into these basin, swales, and so the blue ones here are all the basin categories, the swales and strips, the filter categories, and the infiltrator categories. And this is from an ASCE WEF manual of practice. And so that we didn't come up with this classification. We just tried to fit the terms from these cities into these categories. And so then we could also look at what types of SCMs are implemented in different cities in terms of their numbers. And this is actually now normalizing all of them by the fraction of total SCMs in that city. So before we looked at the density per impervious area changes a lot by city, but also the diversity of these SCMs also varied a lot. So we saw some cities like Pocatello, Idaho on the left are really dominated by a single type, infiltrators, versus on the right we have cities that are using a really diverse set of SCMs. And so we're seeing, ranging from 1 to as many as 13 in this classification. And so we also looked in another article about what factors about the city tell us a little bit about what the mix is that the cities have in terms of what we call their assemblage or the different SCMs that were implemented. And so we saw some physical factors, imperviousness, slope, depth to water table, also socioeconomic in terms of income, and also regulatory factors, and specifically the water body impaired length were important in saying which of these types are implemented. For example, more impaired length and swales and strips and filters went together, but overall we saw these factors are explaining a little more than half of what types of SCMs are implemented. Okay, now I'm gonna switch to thinking about, we looked at SCM implementation in terms of type and density and diversity in different cities. And another question we might want to know is how effective are these SCMs? And are they performing for what we're intending for them to perform? And specifically here, we're going to think at a bigger scale than an individual SCM. And I'm using this term watershed-scale, and I know there's different terms, for different scales. I'll be defining some scales we'll be looking at, but really thinking about where there's a stream draining this area. You could also think smaller and think at a neighborhood scale where maybe you have a sewer shed. So we want to know how successful these SCMs are at a watershed scale, especially in settings where we're actually implementing more SCMs. So we are, I've been hearing about the low impact development efforts. So there's development with really a high density of SCMs. And we want to know just not at those specific SCMs, how are they performing? We want to zoom out and say, how effective are they? And do we have some metrics to characterize how effective they are at this larger scale? Not just how the stream responds in terms of water quality, in terms of hydrology, but do we have a metric to describe the combined effect of these SCMs? And so I'm going to consider a few different metrics here that we commonly use. And this is work that was just submitted. It's a collaboration between me, two collaborators, Charlie Stilwell and Chrissy Hopkins at USGS, and two collaborators at University of Melbourne, Matt Burns and Chris Walsh. Okay, so some commonly used metrics to describe, to describe SCMs. One is thinking about total imperviousness. You might just think about this as just describing the urbanization in a watershed. So this is an example watershed that's 10 square kilometers. It has these gray boxes, each of which are 1 square kilometer, and they're impervious areas. And so there is also an SCM there, but our total imperviousness metric is going to just add up our impervious area, 4 square kilometers, divided by our total area. So we have a 40% impervious watershed. And this might tell us something about what we might expect without any stormwater control. What is the effect of this urbanization on the stream? But now that we are implementing all these SCMs, we are not, we're basically assuming that SCM is not having any effect when we're using this metric, that the SCM is treating some of that impervious area, but it's not captured in this metric. So another metric, this one doesn't have a common name, but another variation of total imperviousness is we might exclude impervious areas that are draining to pervious areas. So this impervious area is not directly connected. It's draining to pervious areas, and so we might exclude that. And so we have 30% of our watershed, connected. But this metric is also not considering that effect of that stormwater control measure. The next metric is another one that is more commonly used, which is called directly connected imperviousness. And in this metric, we're going to consider that this SCM at the top is draining completely to, this impervious area is draining completely to this SCM. And none of it is draining directly to the stream. And so this metric would remove both of these leftmost impervious areas and just consider these two that are further downstream in the network, because those are the ones that are directly connected to the stream by that stormwater drains. And so this would have a metric of 20% for this watershed, 2 square kilometers out of those 10. So a limitation of using this metric is it's assuming that this SCM is so effective to completely remove the effect of that imperviousness on the stream. Well, this is there are variations of this metric. We might think about the percentage of a watershed that's draining to SCMs or treated by SCMs or mitigated by SCMs, the percentage of impervious area that's treated or draining to SCMs. But these are all kind of forming the same assumption that the impervious area that's draining to an SCM is completely removing the effect of that imperviousness from the stream. And we know, and I'll show you some data on this later, that the SCMs are limited in their performance. They cannot, for all storm sizes, completely remove the effect. So they have a limited capacity, and they can overflow or get bypassed by certain storm events based on their design and based on what kind of storm it is. And so this is the total imperviousness is saying the SCM has no effect. The directly connected imperviousness is actually saying that SCMs are completely removing the effect or performing perfectly. And so what we're trying to get at here is another term which we're calling effective imperviousness. I know that sometimes that term is actually used to describe directly connected imperviousness, which is why I'm laying out this table to say that we're using effective imperviousness in a different way here, which is to represent the actual performance of the SCMs. So this is what we want to know. Say this SCM here, and I'll talk about how we can get at this next, but say this SCM has a capacity and such that it can remove 50% of the effect of that impervious area on the stream. And so I'll define this more in a second, but this would correspond to the stream stormwater impact metric of 0.5. And so what we would do then is basically just take these two impervious areas. They're completely, directly connected. There's no SCMs treating them. So we're going to weigh those, as they are. So 2 square kilometers. And then we're going to add this impervious area scaled by this 0.5 impact metric. So we're going to get, 2 square kilometers plus that 0.5 from that impervious area. So we're going to get effective imperviousness for this example watershed of 25%, which is in between the numbers for total imperviousness at the high end and directly connected impervious at the low end. And this is in between those, which we'd expect, because it's not completely ignoring the effect of the SCMs. It's not saying the SCMs perform perfectly. It's actually trying to represent the actual performance of the SCMs somewhere in between that and describe how effective they are. And so this is what we're using as an integrated measure of SCM effectiveness at the watershed scale. And so how would we calculate this? So we applied these 2 different metrics to calculate this. The first metric is called flow disturbance frequency. So basically this is using the frequency of flow disturbance, and I'll explain both of these more on the next slides, but just an overview. Using that flow disturbance and the frequency of that disturbance to represent the performance of those SCMs. This was published by Chris Walsh and others in 2002 and has been only applied in these watersheds in Melbourne, Australia, which I'll show. But we applied it to some other watersheds. And the second method is actually work coming out of some people who are here right now, out of University of Minnesota. And this was work that takes a different approach, looking at rainfall regression analysis. So this is the first method can be applied to watersheds without gauge data, or it could be applied, like what I'm going to show is it's applied in watersheds with monitoring data. But the second one is limited to watersheds with gauge data. It's been applied to many watersheds where we have rainfall runoff measured from those watersheds, but none of the watersheds that have been applied with this method have a really high degree of SCM implementation. So talking about this first method now, so this is using this stream stormwater metric, which I mentioned earlier, which ranges from 0 to 1. So 0 being there's no impact from stormwater on the stream. So those SCMs are completely removing that impact, to 1 where we have maximum impact of stormwater from stormwater stream. So the SCMs are basically not doing anything. And we want to see in between there, how well are the SCMs doing in a combined way. So there's a few different ways that Chris Walsh and others had proposed to, characterize S. The one that, and kind of some metrics, and you can average them. The one that we're going to be using and that they also found was most effective was the runoff frequency submetric. And so this was based on other ecological work found to be the primary driver of stream degradation. Just the frequency of stormwater impacts to the stream. And so this is a calculation using the number of days where there's overflow of untreated stormwater in a year. And you're going to compare that to a pre-urban state as well, or reference target, as well as an impervious area without SCMs. And so this is where you can either use measured data, or you can actually use modeled data if you don't have measurements from this particular watershed, model data based on the SCM design and modeling about how often there would be, with a real rainfall record, how often there would be overflow of untreated stormwater, as well as the expected number of days that an impervious area would release. Basically just above that initial abstraction would, create stormwater from an impervious area without SCMs. And then we also want to have information from, some kind of idea of what a reference state would be. And so in our case, we used a monitored reference state, but you could also use some published information on, in your climate region, in your area, how many days would a reference grassland or forested watershed, have stormwater or storm flow reaching the stream. So there would be this input of runoff frequency. So once we defined S based on how the SCMs are affecting how many days there's this untreated stormwater coming into the stream compared to the reference, compared to an urban without SCMs, then we're basically just taking an area weighted average, which I showed earlier in that simple example, where we're going to weight those impervious areas scaled by this S value, by the stream stormwater impacts. Okay, so the second method is an approach looking at for a storm, there's going to be this total runoff depth. This requires monitoring data to get our total runoff depth, and that's a combination of what's coming from effective impervious areas. Looking at effective impervious areas have contributions to runoff for every single storm event above the initial abstraction. So that precipitation minus the initial abstraction, they're always, if anything is above that, they're contributing. The effective imperviouses are hydraulically connected, so there's nothing in the way. They're contributing for all those storms above the initial abstraction. And then we could have the rest of the catchment, the non-effective imperviousness, and the pervious areas contributing as well during larger storm events. And so those are, thinking about, we could have just the effective impervious areas contributing for those small storms versus the larger storms, a combination of the effective imperviousness and the rest of the watershed. And so this is, this approach is seeking to separate out our events into those events that just have the effective impervious, the smaller events that just have the effective impervious area contributing versus the larger events that have a combination of the effective impervious area and other areas contributing to runoff. And so that this simplifies things, because then in this relationship above, if we ignore those larger events where there's a combination of inputs, and we just look at the effective impervious area for, if we're able to separate those, then that becomes linear, and then that will help us estimate on a watershed scale then we can figure out what is the effective imperviousness based on this rainfall runoff regression analysis. So we applied both of these methods to two places which have dense implementation of SCMs. I'm going to present on both of these in Clarksburg, Maryland, Piscataway homelands, and Melbourne, Australia, Wurundjeri homelands. And I just mentioned the indigenous names because these are both places which are still in, kind of the broader context, recovering from the environmental impacts of settler colonialism, for example, through large-scale wetland removal. And so the left one is in the east coast of the US in the Chesapeake Bay watershed, and then in Melbourne in the south here in Victoria. And so I'm more involved with this Clarksburg one, but I'm going to also talk about, with our collaborators, what we saw in Melbourne with these applications. So, okay, so these watersheds in Clarksburg, we had new development which was built out with dense SCMs. So here's 2002. Our forested control really looked similar in 2002 and 2018. And the bottom here is our urban control, which also had similar land use between the two. And then we had our treatment watersheds here, which were forested and ag land in 2002, and then were converted to suburban residential in 2018. This was part of Montgomery County, Maryland, where the county put extra development regulations on the development of these watersheds for a number of reasons, including it drained to a backup drinking water reservoir, which was characterized as really some of the last high quality streams in Montgomery County, as well as really some public outcry for protection of those streams. And so developers in this watershed were required to put in low impact development. And so these are some of the SEMs that were implemented. So these watersheds are one of the few monitored places where we have 100% of the imperviousness draining to SCMs. So these are watersheds with 0% directly connected impervious area, which is why they're of real interest to us for this method. So the treatment 1 and treatment 2, there's two different watersheds, 33 to 44% imperviousness. They're just under 0.5 square miles there, and you can see the mix of treatment 1 had more single family detached, treatment 2 more townhomes, and a mix of types that you can see here. So there's bioretention, a number of tree boxes, swales, dry ponds, sand filters, infiltration trenches, and dry wells, and so water quality splitters, porous pavement, flow splitters. And so these are really a range of SCM types that we're focusing on infiltration, on storage, and on water quality filtration. Ranging from small scale, like dry wells draining the back half of rooftops, individual households, to some of these larger scale ponds. Okay, so at the second set of watersheds in Melbourne were retrofits, and so these were Little Stringy Bark and Dobson's Creek. This was part of a stream restoration experiment where these coalition, including people from University of Melbourne, went to these watershed, and the people who already lived in these watersheds, and tried to convince people to take on implementation of these SCMs in their private property or on community areas. And so these are showing these sets of watersheds here. So Little Stringy Bark, these are nested watersheds, and Dobson's Creek, and what types we're focused on. And there are a really large number of tanks that were put in, we might call them rain barrels or cisterns, but I'll show some pictures. They're larger scale than what we might think of. In Melbourne, in Australia, because of the millennium drought, they have much more implementation of rainwater harvesting for indoor use. Their plumbing codes are not restrictive in the same way as here, and so they really had much larger scale adoption of that rainwater harvesting as part of that millennium drought incentive. So they really implemented a lot of tanks, which have a different purpose. That is removing that stormwater from the entire water cycle. It's never going to be seen in the stream again because it's being harvested for indoor use and then going to the wastewater treatment plant rather than, maybe being infiltrated and seen in the stream later. And they also had some rain gardens and downpipe diverters, so looking at draining to pervious areas. Okay, so, and some more information about what was going on in Melbourne. These SCMs were designed to minimize uncontrolled runoff and maximize volume retention, and restore that quality and volume. They were trying to reduce the volume of stormwater by harvesting, but they were limited in terms of the indoor demand the space and just getting people to adopt these. And so retrofits, just going, one of the contrasts that we see here is they weren't able to meet their SCM targets through this retrofit program. And it was, it's more challenging than the Greenfield program that I was showing earlier. Okay, so cutting to the results now with these different methods of effective imperviousness. So up top here, we have the 2 treatment watersheds in Clarksburg, and then the 5 Melbourne watersheds. We have in blue here, the total imperviousness, and then the 2 other colors here are the 2 different methods, flow disturbance frequency and rainfall runoff regression for these watersheds. So one of the things we see here is that actually both methods for effective imperviousness give relatively similar results, not exactly the same, but they're in many cases close together for their estimates for effective imperviousness. We also see that this line here that's shown for different watersheds, that's a measure of watershed-scale SCM effectiveness. That's saying how much is total imperviousness reduced when we think about the effect of those SCMs. The SCMs are bringing down the runoff response, bringing down the flow disturbance frequency, and by how much. And so this is characterizing by how much. So overall, you can see in Clarksburg, even though Clarksburg watershed started higher in terms of total imperviousness, they had that density of SCM implementation with that new development was able to bring down the effective imperviousness quite a bit more than in most of the Melbourne watersheds, some of which actually weren't too urban in the first place, or too total impervious in the first place. I'm going to focus more now on the Clarksburg data and compare those effective impervious numbers with stream outcomes. And this paper at the bottom has a bunch more stream outcomes, which I'm not going to talk about right now: peak flows, runoff, nitrate, chloride, sediment, geomorphic. This summarizes like 5 or 6 other papers talking about all these other outcomes and puts it together in 20 years of monitoring summary. I'm just going to talk about the benthic macroinvertebrates as an integrative measure of how the streams did as a result of this implementation. So there was yearly sampling. The forested control watershed was really pretty steady and excellent to good condition over this time period. The urban control was fair to poor. The treatment watersheds now are shown with their development periods in gray. Both of them dropped in terms of their benthic index of biotic integrity during that treatment period. Treatment 1 rebounded to some degree to go into that fair to good category, oscillate between those, versus treatment 2 actually kind of stayed degraded in terms of this index in that fair to poor category. And now I'm going to consider how well do these measures of different metrics show that. So total imperviousness isn't working very well. 33 to 44% in terms of total imperviousness would say that the benthic indexes would be just poor in these watersheds, but we're seeing that they're higher than we would expect with our total imperviousness. So this isn't representing what the streams really look like. The directly connected impervious area metric, which was the directly connected impervious is 0%, which would say that the SCMs are completely treating all of the effects of stormwater. And there's really no urban impact in these watersheds, which is not what we saw. And so this would say that they should just, kind of go along exactly steady. We didn't see that. There was some impact from the urbanization, and these SCMs were not able to completely remove because they had the capacity limitations. So this is also not representing it very well. The effective imperviousness of 5 to 12% is, we think, describing this effect much better, which is that they're somewhat impacted. 5% is more like the treatment 1 versus 12% in treatment 2, somewhat impacted, but in between, not completely poor, but not doing just as well as they were before. So this is, we're taking this as really matching what we're seeing in the stream much better than either of those other metrics. And so that's summary of my presentation, and happy to take questions about this now. Thank you.
Thank you, Aditi. So, questions from in the audience? Yes. Hang on, I'll bring this to you.
Thank you for the presentation. My name is Brian Jastrom. I'm the Senior Water Scientist at Rockleaf Water Environmental. When you're studying effective imperviousness and the effect of runoff on streams, what sort of data sets would be most useful if you just had them for your research?
To get at the effect, well, I guess, here we were trying to do two different things, which is just to estimate effective imperviousness. So for that information, for that second method, you would want runoff and rainfall. For the first method, you actually don't need that. That would be good to have, but you don't need that. You can try to use other information to compare how effective, that's why I use success in the title, because it gets repetitive, saying how effective the effective imperviousness is. How successful this metric is, then you'd want to, I was comparing to some other stream outcomes, but you don't need those to estimate the effective imperviousness in the first place. So maybe it depends what part you're trying to get at.
Yeah, I was thinking if you want to look at metrics for like stream water quality and environmental health, maybe having pollutant load data or flow volume data or like peak discharge data that might help with the effect of the runoff on ecosystem.
Yeah, so I mentioned with that Walsh approach with flow disturbance frequency, that S with the stream stormwater impact, that there's different ways that they proposed to characterize that. And we were just using runoff frequency, which is, a simple one to use. They also had water quality. So they also had a different sub-metric where they, in their case, it was actually modeled water quality impacts, but looking at pollutant loads in this with the SEMs versus without versus a reference state. You could also look at volume. They did not really want to use peak flows in their system because they didn't, Chris Walsh is, largely coming from an ecological background and didn't see the direct relationship between peak flows and the stream biota. And so, he didn't think that was as representative, but, there's different variations of the sub-metrics that could be used. But yeah, we were just using this, that have been used before in Melbourne, but we were just using that one. And actually you could average them as well. But yeah, the flow disturbance is, we picked that because they're kind of converging on that as, a key one.
Okay, do we have a question from online?
Online question. All right. Our first online question for today is, were you able to consider the state of various SCMs and whether they had been maintained properly?
Yeah, so we did not consider that in this analysis. Both of these were relatively recent SEM dense implementations, but I would say we didn't consider that directly, but we were looking at the watershed response in terms of, for example, the runoff response. And so indirectly that would be captured if they're not maintained and if they're not performing to, have an effect on the runoff from those SEMs, then you'd be able to see that, combined effect downstream.
Yes.
Paula Kalinowski from MPCA. So I couldn't help but notice on, I think it was the second to last slide, how as we might expect during construction, the benthic index took a steep decline. And it made me kind of wonder, well, is it as much about the damage that's done during that period? And, with these SEMs in place, perhaps the stream would rebound to its previous level if we had better sediment controls, because clearly sediment is going to be an issue for the biotic indices. So was there any comparison or any information that you could look at about how those sites were managed during construction that would provide some insight into how they responded in the longer term?
Yes, thank you. So yeah, they were also using, sediment and erosion control practices, at the time of this development was trying to use the most up-to-date practices, yet there was still, a massive input of sediment during that time that, we could see this drop in the stream integrity. And so I think, maybe extrapolating beyond what you directly asked is there are other factors in urban development besides just the stormwater, which are affecting what's going on with stream health. A key one is actually what's going on during development. Maybe that effect is washing out later, but really during that time is a key effect. And then also, I mentioned that the study also looked at some other variables. Chloride and road salt was increasing throughout this whole time period in these treatments, is not being reduced, in fact, maybe exacerbated by these SEMs, which are really focusing on infiltration of stormwater. And so there's a lot of summer chloride, which some of these, sensitive aquatic biota are not happy about. And so the stormwater, just is not the only factor in what's going on during development.
So that means there's more of the story to tell.
Yes.
That's what you're saying, yeah. I'd like to interject a question. Did the streams ever go dry? Because, the flow was reduced and your IBI went down, and normally the standard thought is, or the standard assumption is the IBI should go up when the flow is reduced. But if the streams went dry, then the IBI is going to bottom out.
Yeah, these streams didn't go dry.
Okay, thank you. Question from online.
Another question online. This is a bit of a longer one. While I appreciate the index approach, this type of analysis does not address the performance of various low-impact developments. Using imperviousness may be appropriate for a very broad assessment of watershed performance. It is not sufficient to scale various low-impact development from local scale to watershed scale. Will the next level of analysis be focused on scaling lot-level LID performance to watershed scale?
Yeah, so this is, these both measures, both metrics that we're looking at are considering some sort of larger scale. It doesn't need to, I mentioned the stream. This could be, the rainfall runoff analysis could be implemented on a sewer shed scale where you have sewer shed monitoring, but you do need runoff information. So it needs to be big enough scale where you have runoff. The first method could also be applied to smaller scales than a stream, but also is not directly applicable to a lot scale. And so this is thinking about a larger scale than the LID at a lot. And so, just thinking about the combined effects of these SEMs at a neighborhood, a development, a larger scale. And so there are, I don't know, this metric isn't, the kind of premise of it is that we're trying to see the combined effects and characterize those combined effects, how successful they are. So you would need sort of a different type of approach to look at smaller lot scale, and characterize the success at that scale.
Okay, question from in-house.
Hi, my name is Mark Deutschman from the lab here. I commend your work in trying to connect physical phenomena for the watershed to the biology. We don't do that enough. So thanks for that. I think that's a great step forward. My comments related to whether you consider timing of the hydrograph and whether you have thought about a simple metric that might develop time of travel isoplus for the watershed, and then relate the effectiveness of the practice to the volume there and the time it takes for that volume to reach the outlet. A simple volume extraction kind of technique. I'd be curious if what that would look like, I guess, more than anything. But again, assume that whatever the volume is of the practice gets removed from when it hits the hydrographic peak at the downstream watershed outlet, and then wait accordingly to time of travel. So anyway, I'd be curious about your thoughts.
Yeah, thank you. So this, we did look at in both of those treatment watersheds, we looked at paired rainfall and storm flow responses. So we actually have the information to look at the lag between those. I don't think we already have, or at least if we have, I don't remember the results of that. We did see in comparison with the forested watershed, the forested watershed just had fewer responses to rain events. So some of the smaller rain events just didn't produce a storm flow response. The stream was just stayed at base flow below about 17 millimeters, versus the urban watersheds responded to much smaller rain events. And so that's part of the story with the lag, is that the urban watershed just has more rainfall storm flow pairs. The forested watershed sometimes has rainfall but no storm flow, and so there's not really a lag applicable in that case with no response. But yeah, but that is something we actually do have the information about, but we haven't analyzed yet.
Okay, let's try another question from online.
We have a question here from Isabel Horvath with EPA Region 5. In your first project showing diversity of SCM types and names at different cities, it was interesting to see this diversity categorized by MS4 Phase 1 and 2 and CSO presence. Can you explain in more detail why those categories were considered, or any expectations investigating that context, and speak more to the pattern observed?
Yes, thank you. So we looked at that because we thought it may have, we just thought it may be one of the explanatory variables in terms of looking at these different cities and the regulatory context that they were in. And yeah, so that's why we characterize the cities in this way. And we did see that, like I mentioned in the next slide, that these filters were really implemented more in cities which were in the cities which had these more water body length impaired. And so, yeah, we were thinking about just the overall context. Are they CSOs? They might need to, think about these initial, just preventing the combined sewer overflows, capturing that initial input into the combined system. So we thought that might have an effect, as well as, cities which may have just spent, phase one cities spend a longer time implementing SCMs, maybe have, a greater overall investment over time in terms of, just seeing if that showed up as a larger number of SCMs.
Thank you. Randy.
Thanks, John. Randy Neprash. I'm going to cheat a bit by asking two questions, if I may, but I can say them both reasonably quickly. So you've arrived at a relatively accurate metric. What's your thinking about how the metric would be useful? And by a variety of different parties, say regulators, state agencies, to local programs and MS4 permittees. The other question is, your work is really focused on streams as the receiving water. In our landscapes, frequently most, if not all of the receiving waters are wetlands and lakes. So the question is, to what extent is this work applicable to those types of landscapes?
Yeah, thanks, Randy. And I think those questions are related in a way. So yeah, hearing both of them at once. So in terms of the first question about some applications of the metric and use by different entities. So yeah, we applied these metrics to these two watersheds. Basically, they're kind of put forth some ways to estimate this and applied it in these two cases. One of the reasons we did that was to try to provide information to other groups who have watersheds or smaller scales, if you want to call them subwatersheds or catchments, that have the data to quantify these metrics and relate it to stream outcomes in other places. And so, for example, thinking about evaluating lakes or wetlands, if there are places with SEMs, implemented and information to estimate the effective imperviousness for an area draining to a lake or wetland, and compare how is this metric doing to, how do we make sense of it with how does the lake water quality look? How does the wetland look? And does this metric make sense in this context? Because I don't know yet, because we've just been looking at streams so far. And to see whether this is something that we can, in a broader context, use as a metric across more watersheds to be able to compare them. So that could have a few applications. One is to compare the success of SEM implementation across many different settings. And so these are, it may seem odd that I'm comparing Clarksburg, Maryland, and Melbourne, Australia, which are two settings with very different, climates, very different types of SEMs you saw there, all kinds of differences between them, but we're trying to kind of come up with some sort of standardized way to compare the success of these SEMs. And I think it would benefit from looking at many other watersheds where this is, this kind of information is available. And then I think a next step for this, how it could be used in other contexts where you don't have that watershed already built or retrofits already put in place, the existing SEM. So yeah, what I was just talking about is more about applying this metric to existing landscapes and seeing how this metric performs. And a future step could be evaluating low impact development based on its proposed SEMs, and then seeing how does that combined and really focusing on, this is where we get into that first method, which does not require existing monitoring data. So it would be using model data, for example. How would we reduce some of these impacts on a combined scale from this proposed network of SEMs? And that would require us to, have some level of confidence that this metric is going to represent the overall stream or lake or wetland outcomes well. But if we have, that established, maybe that needs, quite a bit more settings for this to be applied to, then it could be, a way to project on, future SEM implementation and what that combined success would be.
So I'd like to finish this half of the session with a comment, and that is that This IBI versus total impervious area, fraction total impervious area is kind of an assumption. I see it over and over again. It's basically the same data plotted many times. And as we were discussing, we have really made our career here at the University of Minnesota, Santa Fe Falls Laboratory, out of testing these assumptions. And I think it's rewarding to see that you had developed a creative way to test this assumption, and you have found out that for these two watersheds, it is not correct, the plot of IBI against total impervious area. There's a lot more to the story, but I think your techniques that you developed will be really good for people in the future to do similar tests on these assumptions, because we need to test these assumptions. There are many assumptions in stormwater treatment, stormwater analysis, that it turns out are not true. We have to test these assumptions. And so I'd like to congratulate you on this. Let's thank Aditi.
Thank you.
Welcome back to the Minnesota Stormwater Seminar Series. My name is Andy Erickson. It's my honor to host and moderate the seminar and the panel now. We have a great panel lined up. I'm going to introduce our panelists, and they're going to give us their relation to the topic today. And then we're going to go into your questions. So please have your questions ready, both in the room and online as well, please. So I'll introduce our local experts that have graciously agreed to serve on our panel today. I'm going to start at the far end, my right, your left. Our first panelist is Julie Westerlund, who is the One Watershed, One Plan Coordinator at the Minnesota Board of Water and Soil Resources. The acronym we use is BWSR, which I think is a great name. So Julie, what's your relation to the topic today?
Well, thank you very much, Andy. It's a pleasure to be here. So in my current role with the Board of Water and Soil Resources, I work with partnerships that do watershed planning. And we're operating actually at a much different scale than what we saw in the presentation this morning. We are doing planning in Minnesota on major watershed, the hydrologic unit code 8 scale. So really large scale plan development. And then that implementation obviously happens on a much smaller scale. But we still end up having a lot of the same questions about how do we think about effectiveness of practices? There's a lot of concern about accountability, especially another part of my job is making grants to local implementers to actually carry out the practices that are indicated in those plans. And so how are we accountable for that? And how do we think about the effectiveness of the work that we're doing? In the planning process, we do a lot of prediction. We use a lot of models and tools to think about if we do these scenarios of implementation, what is that going to look like? So that kind of gets back to one of the questions that Randy had asked. I also previously worked for the Department of Natural Resources, also at the state here in Minnesota. And I also worked for a local government. I worked for Minnehaha Creek Watershed District for a while, doing outreach and communications about the work that we did. So, you know, there's the storytelling aspect and how do you think about again, the effectiveness of our work. And I started my career as a fisheries biologist, so I'm very interested in the biological aspect of our stream work and also interested in stormwater management. Many of the folks in the room I've worked with in the past on innovative stormwater management and those low impact development strategies. So that's my career in a just long nutshell.
In a nutshell, in a very big nutshell. Thank you, Julie.
Yep.
Our next panelist is Ed Matthiesen, who is a principal and senior civil engineer at Stantec. Ed, from your experience and perspective, how do you relate to today's topic?
Well, I'm coming from the practitioner side, and so I work with watersheds scales of between 400 square miles and 30 square miles. And on the practitioner side, we have to deal with what the pollutants are, and essentially the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency and sometimes the EPA tells us what the problems are. A lot of times we have our own data defining that, but on this scale, for the larger watersheds, it would be useful to help define kind of what are the problems and are there potential solutions there. In our work, though, we have to get down to really what are projects in order to solve the problem. So we end up going with sub-watershed assessments, breaking the watersheds down into scales that are of, say, 1 square mile to 10 square miles in size, so we can actually get our hands around solving the problem. So this would help us on the larger scale projects. A lot of our watersheds, we've had data for 30 plus years now, and now we tend to rotate our receiving water bodies on a 4-year cycle. So we have upcoming data and new data all the time to tell us if the practices we're doing actually make sense and do we have any measurable outcomes, and to tell us what new problems are. So typically we deal with lakes are our main issue, and we have nutrients are the primary problem. And then with our streams, it's mainly TSS, total suspended solids are our issues. So stream bank stabilization, in-lake treatments, whole watershed treatments, looking at these SCM methods, we apply those all over the place and trying to find what is the most cost-effective method is the way we try to handle it. So in a roundabout way, it helps us with a larger scale.
That's great. Thank you, Ed. Our next panelist is Paige Ahlborg, who's now the Assistant Administrator from the Ramsey-Washington Metro Watershed District. Paige, from your experience and perspective, how do you relate to the topic today?
Yeah, thanks, Andy. So for our non-Minnesota listeners, I'll do a quick explanation of watershed districts. So in Minnesota, we have special units of government known as watershed districts, and we have taxing authority and also regulatory authority. So with our watershed district, we've had permit rules in place since 2006, where we require new development and redevelopment to install best management practices. And we also have several grant programs where we help design and install best management practices. So we have thousands of BMPs installed since that time. We keep track of all the pollutant removals and costs and cost benefit for all of those, so we can make sure that we're, as we review these and design them, that we're keeping up with the, latest standards and using the best practices out there, and making sure that, when other engineers come in with those for our permit rules, that we're, keeping up with all that as well.
Excellent. Thank you, Paige. Thank you so much for that. I will not ask for Aditi's relation to the topic because she set the topic for us today. So now we're ready for your audience questions. I hope there are some online. I hope there's some in the room. Would anyone like to get us started? Oh, we got one. Hold on.
One that just popped in my brain is maintenance regulations. We do a lot of regulations around implementation, and we enforce implementation because you have to get a permit. But once it's built, the impact of lack of maintenance, I think, is one of the most significant failure points for the whole system, right? There is no enforcement mechanism for maintenance as such, right? You can't hold a permit up on maintenance. So in some areas, there are maintenance reasons, but what would be the impact, do you think, on this if there was an enforcement mechanism for maintenance? Would that significantly change the study? And that's what we get. And there is your problem, right? And that's the problem on maintenance, right? Everyone says it's silent. It's too hard.
I'll venture into this. Now that I've kind of gone more retired, I'm now a volunteer on the Plymouth Environmental Quality Commission. So now I'm getting to see inside the city of Plymouth, Minnesota, how Public Works is handling stuff. Well, staff they know it's a permitted function for their stormwater. So there kind of is an enforcement method that they already have to get a permit. So it is kind of handled that way. And I know in my city of Plymouth, they have a strong budget for maintenance of the BMPs that are in place. They've got the technology for it. They've got the personnel. They have the money for it. As a taxpayer, I know I'm paying it too because I've got a monthly charge for a utility. So I think the enforcement's kind of there because of the permitting, my opinion of it. The question is, how many of these are on private land? Within the city, I don't know. I have been a watershed district engineer for a number of years, and the things we hated were HOAs. They were tough to deal with. They turned over hands. They didn't have the funding, and a roof or a pool got much more focus than a failing BMP. and they wouldn't even know they had a failing BMP, and if they had staff turnover, they wouldn't even know they had a BMP. So that is the tough nut to crack. For the ones that are publicly owned and for larger commercial properties where they do have a permit on it, I'd say, yeah, those are probably pretty well maintained. But for those smaller ones, it's kind of throw my hands up and I don't know what to do with them.
I just want to interject quickly. There is actually some recent research. So the Minnesota Stormwater Research Council is working on cracking the HOA nut. So we are trying to, bridge those gaps and make that more successful and a better interaction. Sorry.
Yeah.
Oh, HOA acronym, sorry, we get caught up in this. Homeowners Association.
Yeah, I can talk briefly about our inspection program. So we require all permitted sites to sign a maintenance agreement, which is into perpetuity, the lifetime of the project. With that, the owner is required to submit an annual inspection report. We've probably gotten a handful of those over the years, but we have really beefed up our inspection program. So we have full-time inspector who goes out and we have inspectors who do ongoing construction installation, and they're out there when the BMPs are installed, but then we have someone who inspects these closed out permitted BMPs, making sure that they're functioning, getting in touch with those owners, and it's been pretty successful with getting failing BMPs or even just general maintenance caught up. And then with our grant projects, the property owners sign either a 5 or 20-year agreement, and we go out and do inspections on those, and those those are in people's, usually their front yards or in their yards, and they have a little bit of cost associated with those, so they're a little more likely to do that maintenance, where with the permit sites, a lot of times it's the engineers and developers that are putting those in. The property owner some of the time doesn't even know those are in there, so we're trying to be on top of that early on too, and making sure that the property owner is aware that they have an operation and maintenance plan, so that we can all review that together and make sure they're keeping up with it.
One thing I'll comment on, somebody else had asked about maintenance in the watersheds I was looking at, which were both relatively new implementation of SEMs, but over time, we could look at how that effectiveness changes with, good maintenance or not, and, potential port maintenance leading to that increase in effective imperviousness over time. So in the Denver metro area, there's one of the big reasons that there's hesitation to go too small in terms of distributed stormwater control measures is to avoid to really try to have all these as publicly maintained facilities to really see that the privately maintained ones are not maintained effectively.
Let's take a question online.
From what you have learned so far, are we expending proper effort to protect our receiving water bodies through the implementation of SCMs? What can we do better?
Well, since people are looking at me, I guess I will take a crack at this. I would say, sort of given the number of impairments that we have in Minnesota, and I will also caveat that by saying we do a lot of monitoring in Minnesota relative to other places. I think, more is always needed to especially do restoration of our impaired resources, and of course, to protect our precious lakes and streams and wetlands that are not yet impaired, if we know it's a lot more expensive to fix something once it's broke than to protect it ahead of time. So, proper effort, I suppose that would constitute keeping things out of an impaired status. And I think a lot more is needed. It's just a matter of the resources to do it. And many, we were talking a little bit about public versus private land. In much of the state, our water problems are coming from privately owned land. And so convincing folks to engage in voluntary conservation is one of the big challenges that we have, in addition to the, sort of funding and capacity to get the work done.
I'll put my 2 cents in about the effectiveness of the BMPs over time. So one of my experiences has been was the Watershed Commission engineer for the Shingle Creek watershed for 20 plus years. Before I started, thank God the EPA got hold of data and said, you've got 10 impaired water bodies here, all lakes. So we had a mission to then get these lakes off the impaired waters list. We did the subwatershed assessment. We have a permit program where, as Paige mentioned, developers have to meet certain requirements for the development to get the stormwater to meet certain standards before it leaves its site. Did a lot of projects through the municipality, some watershed directed, a lot of funding through the PCA, EPA. Anyway, after 20 years, we've got, I think, 6 water bodies came off the impaired waters list. This year, 3 are coming off from the city of Plymouth. I didn't think it would happen in my career or lifetime, and I guess I'll have to work till I'm 100 to make it, to get all of them off. But over a 20-year period, I think it is a success story that you can back out of it. You know, the feature that we look for is getting off the things we measure, but the residents are noting better water clarity. That's kind of what they pick up on, water clarity. So we're getting comments from the residents, hey, we like what you've been doing, which of course then that kind of keeps the whole ball rolling with other projects going on, and you can work smaller and upstream more and have a little more money because they're seeing some results in this. So I guess out of the methods we're using, there is workable options to solve these problems, and getting water bodies off the impaired waters list is, I think, a success story that a lot of us here have had a part in.
I think a couple of things come to mind as to what we can do better, and maintenance is obviously on there. I think with us at the Watershed District, our board has been very proactive with the maintenance approach and understanding that if we're going to spend the taxpayer dollars to put these in, whether it's through our grant program or other state or federal grants, that we need to be ready to pay for that maintenance. So we have a good maintenance grant available to property owners that put in projects, but also, if there's a project that we fund, we'll pay for that 2 years of maintenance. So having that support, and also we work with a lot of other government agencies. We have 12, all or parts of 12 cities within 2 counties. So working with them and, talking with their councils about the importance of maintenance, if we're able to get grant funding to pay for project installation, talking with them about that supporting that ongoing maintenance that would be required of those. And then also education, educating residents. We get a lot of calls of, that maybe their lake has really good water quality, but there's a lot of weeds in there. So explaining the benefits of aquatic vegetation and going through that, whether it's through on-site trainings or, meeting one-on-one with homeowners and talking through that. We've seen good success with that.
To go along with the maintenance topic, prior to this being asked to be a panelist here, I wanted to get a little prepared. So I asked 5 other engineers I work with, who have a lot of experience. I asked them to define, in this case, I put it in the terms of what do you see as green infrastructure? What's your definition? And I asked, what are the advantages and disadvantages? The only one word that came through with all 5 people I talked to for disadvantages was maintenance. So it's an ongoing problem that we still need to crack.
Of course you have more questions. I actually want to interject with a question that kind of builds off this, and maybe it's a reframing a little bit of a previous question, but I'd be interested to say or hear what you would say to what information do you think gives us the best indication that our SCMs are actually having a positive impact? So we heard the tool talking about effective impervious, implementing that. I heard Ed say clarity, water clarity. The residents are tying it to clarity. Is, in your relative spheres, what piece of information at least gives you confidence that we're making a positive impact? It doesn't have to be one single thing, but.
2 water bodies that typically work with, we've got lakes and streams. For the lakes, the thing is water clarity. It's easy to measure, the residents pick up on it, so that's pretty understandable. Also, it's kind of like air quotation, weeds. Obviously, they're beneficial lake bed plants that we need to have. Residents need to get their boats out, so it's a struggle. But then on the streams, I think benthic measurements is like the easiest one to measure. It gives us an array of kind of what's going on with stream flow, what's going on with water quality, habitat. If we get the benthic measurements there, then we have other things that live in the stream. And I know the work that I've done on trout streams, that is really a good indicator that if you're going to have some good trout response in that area. So those are my two areas to simplify: water clarity and benthic measurements for streams.
Oh, I thought I might sneeze, so that was, I was trying to.
Any other thoughts?
I would agree with Ed. I think the benthic macroinvertebrates in particular, the index of biological integrity is a nice integrative way to look at the health of the ecosystem. And, you know, that is better than if you're going to take a snapshot in time of data, that's better than a grab sample or something else that would tell you about what's happening in that moment. The biological community is going to tell you more about what's been happening over time to that resource.
Any others? All right, I want to take questions from this side and work our way this way.
Just as a follow-up, what about some index of stream stability, geomorphic stability, where you don't have to go out in a stream and, you know, collect benthic samples and then analyze them? I realize that stream stability is challenging at times, but what are your thoughts on using that as some sort of index or metric for success?
Okay, I'll take another one at this. Yes, I like doing that. And I think now with drone footage, and we've been applying this Wisconsin and DNR method for a quick assessment of how much erosion is taking place each year. It gives you a pretty good baseline, you know, thumb in the air, you're going to test the wind, what that stream's doing. And if you look at that over a couple of years, especially if you go back to aerial photos, go back to 1930s, you can see what a migration is for that stream and how much soil it has lost in some of those areas. And then you can pick out those banks that are the real problem child. So you can look at that over a period of time. So I like that approach. It's relatively cost effective. And so you can get a lot of stream done quickly. And then where you have those problems and you want to go out and do a visual site assessment and maybe put in bank pins or some other monitoring to measure that so you can get them scaled, because you can't, no watershed that I know of can afford to do all of them in 1 year. It's another 20 to 30 year process to tackle those. But it's a highly cost effective because there always is phosphorus attached to those soil particles, and they're moving downstream and they're going to be mobile and start being a problem.
Yeah, I think just thinking through some of the projects we've done, we walk our creeks every 2 years to monitor the stream beds, look for erosion issues, other, you know, drainage issues, illicit discharges, so a variety of things, and then have those earmarked for projects going forward. We've worked with a few county projects and city projects that are on creek land to do some of those stabilization efforts. So it is a growing priority for the watershed.
Let's take an online question and we'll come back to in the room.
Have any of you had to deal with the effective end of life of a BMP? Is the owner asked to replace the BMP? Is it decommissioned or something else?
I'm going to let these two answer that one.
I can start it, I guess. Yeah, we've had a few, so I'm trying to think of some that we've decommissioned. I don't know if they were officially at their end of life or they just were not maintained and we said this is beyond anything we want to help repair or that the owner will repair. So that's where we saw a handful of those and then have tried to prevent that, right, through our ongoing inspections. And was that, I forgot the second part of the question.
Was that on the owner, was that public, or who was responsible for?
Yes, yeah, so most of those, so we do in our agreement, we have, okay, the watershed district can come in and fix this, but then the owner has to pay us back for that cost, but again, that's very hard to enforce. We have never gone that route. So we have a little more leverage with BMPs that are on city property, you know, working with the city or county to get those repaired, versus private land where we just may say, okay, this is now, you know, it's supposed to be an infiltration basin, now it's a wet pond, and we'll just leave it at that for now. But trying to stay on top of that and avoid those issues as best we can going forward.
I haven't run across a decommissioned one, but the most common one where it's kind of like end of life is the stormwater pond gets filled up with sediment and needs to be cleaned out. You know, some cities, you know, Eden Prairie's got thousands of ponds, and it becomes a financial impact. So you've got to get them scaled so you can knock off a couple every year, because they are very expensive to clean out those ponds. But I think that's where you need to go with it for not necessarily end of life, but repurposing them, or getting them back to where they were functional. So you get another 10 to 15 years out of it. And hopefully in that watershed, you've stopped a lot of those inputs so it lasts a lot longer.
I'll add one thing on that to what Ed brought up with the stormwater ponds. So we, with our watershed district, have started, I don't know if we have an official name, but kind of a collaborative effort with our cities to do pond cleanouts. So we have an annual capital improvement project that we do every year. You know, that might be routine maintenance or some stream bank repairs or things like that that are district owned, but then allowing our cities to jump onto that contract. So we'll help with surveying those ponds, taking on some of that effort, because yeah, it's a big expense to cities. They may not have the staff time to take that on either. So taking on some of that and then coordinating the contract, hopefully lowering some of that cost, just given that it's a larger contract versus just one pond clean out. And I think this year we have 20 ponds on the list through our various cities, which is kind of a record for us, but it's been a big success and a way to kind of rejuvenate those stormwater ponds.
I think for the maintenance, one of the things we're going to see is we've been installing a lot of, say, the University of Minnesota kind of developed iron sand filters. So we've been monitoring those for some time. We're still seeing a very good dissolved phosphorus capture rate. At some point, we figure we're going to have to add some more iron to them. Fortunately, that iron is a commodity that we have, so we can, and even the iron sand is a commodity, so we could, we think, till in more and resurrect those, the function of those again. But that's one thing we keep an eye on, is iron sand filters.
We'll take another question. Did you still have a question?
Hi, John Chapman, faculty here at the U of M. So back to monitoring and monitoring approaches. I like the discussion earlier talking about water clarity and IBI scores. And can you say a little bit more about the timing? I think even Professor Bhaskhar's data on treatment one had some fluctuation in the IBI scores from year to year. And so is there kind of, you know, Julie, your comment about grab samples aren't as good as benthic because benthic kind of averages day-to-day variations. So what, you know, how often should we be collecting these samples? Or, you know, what is the approach kind of on knowing what's going on in your watershed? How often do we have to collect data, you know, even beyond what we're collecting? Yeah.
Well, I guess I can take an initial crack at that. In Minnesota, we've established an approach now where we are on a 10-year cycle of going to all of the state's major watersheds to collect information and get an assessment of watershed health, and it does include those indices of biological integrity, both for lakes and streams. And that's not very often in terms of monitoring frequency at that scale, but it's really expensive. So I think the question that you're asking, John, you know, really is a matter of balancing resources and scale and importance of, you know, relative importance of understanding how these watershed systems are behaving, and how it's a question of allocating resources, because one can really never have enough data, now can one? So then it becomes a matter of prioritization and really thinking about where are our public values and which of those resources do we want to really understand. Where have there been changes to the landscape? Where have there been focused efforts on implementation? Where are we expecting to see some changes based on the changes, in activity on the land? So I think those are all questions that we need to ask when we're thinking about deploying our resources relative to monitoring.
Oh, I can give you a number. Because the way this works out is you're allotted a certain amount of money from the watershed organization or the city, and then you have to back into what can we get done for that. And it works out like once every 5 years, you do an in-depth analysis for a particular water body or section of stream. And that's kind of how it works out. Also under ditch law, it's kind of interesting, is that you're required to inspect your ditches 20% in any 1 year. So that's another 5-year period. So it's kind of working out that get it budgeted for every 5 years. You're going to do an in-depth analysis on a particular water body or ditch section or stream section. And it seems to be palatable with those paying the bills.
And I'll just add that what I commented on, that 10-year cycle, is what the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency with its other state agency partners are doing for surface water, but there's also more local monitoring approaches for the local watersheds where they have resources, or communities where they have resources to do more intensive monitoring. And then we have sort of different schedules for groundwater monitoring as well.
Well, something else Paige mentioned with watershed districts in Minnesota, they've been around since the 1950s. Now they're primarily set up to take over agricultural ditches, but as demands for water quality increased, they got pushed to take over water quality work. And starting in the 1970s, 1980s, they started doing a lot of water quality sampling too. So there's a decent data set going back. So with the variability in any 1 year, it really isn't worth it just to keep going after these in any 1 year, unless you've got a totally new BMP and you've got to check something out, but that's not on a watershed scale. So with all this data we've got, we can see trend lines, and we've got, I think, pretty good indicators and confidence level saying this water body is getting worse or better, or just there's really no change. So still it's like that every 5 years seems to be an appropriate number for us.
And in the case study that I was presenting, Montgomery County Department of Environmental Protection was a partner, and they undertook this every year spring sampling because of the massive changes that were going on in that area. Not doing that everywhere, but focusing in on those watersheds.
And I think that speaks to, the metrics. I asked about what are the important information, and I heard water quality metrics in the receiving waters, right? And it speaks to kind of the resilience and the lag between what we do in the watershed and how long it takes for those receiving waters to respond. So that's what I'm hearing. That's what it speaks to me. That was in person. Let's take another online question, please.
Work been done to evaluate the potential negative impacts of various SCMs, particularly thinking about the potential for impacts to groundwater quality from infiltration. We at MDH are particularly interested in how we can best balance the need for stormwater management with groundwater protection. We'd be interested in any studies on water quality impacts to groundwater to focus our recommendations to local partners. We don't want to be overly restrictive, but want to ensure a proposed SCM is appropriate for a particular location. Failing BMPs would also be of concern for this reason. Is anyone looking at this anywhere, not limited to Minnesota?
Maybe I'll chime in a little bit. We have done a little bit of literature review. So there are some studies out there, and there's been a number of, not just in Minnesota, but beyond Minnesota, a number of studies looking at the interaction between surface water from stormwater infiltration and groundwater impacts. So there are some studies. There have been literature reviews that have been done. Some of them are getting a little dated at this point, but there is some literature out there, and we can share that information. But if the panelists would like to contribute any other knowledge they may have, please do.
I commented on the road salt connection, and that's a trade-off between having the road salt, you know, if you're not infiltrating that stormwater, it's going directly into the stream very quickly. If you're focusing on infiltrating it, then it's going into the groundwater and going into the stream potentially later, maybe next summer during, or, you know, maybe years from then, during low flows. And so both of those are kind of a trade-off with which resource you're wanting to kind of have that pollution contribute to, you know, at which timing. And so really the overall approach is, you know, about source control for the road salt. And you know, but yeah, if you're zooming into that infiltration, then we did see, you know, in these watersheds in particular, consistent increases in chloride with all that focus of infiltration in the watershed.
So back in the late 90s, I got hired at the DNR to work on something called the Metro Trout Stream Watershed Protection Initiative, which was all about looking at the effects of development, rapid development in our suburban areas that also had trout streams, which are of course very sensitive to the addition of impervious surfaces. And this idea of infiltrating stormwater to reduce the volume of stormwater coming off of those hard surfaces and protect those trout streams became really popular. And I got roped in with some of these characters sitting up front here to really be, you know, thinking about innovative stormwater management practices. And, you know, there were some voices in the background going, well, be careful what you're putting into that, you know, groundwater. And we sort of went, well, but we got to protect these trout streams. And the place I happened to be working was, one of the watersheds was the Valley Branch watershed, which is in the eastern Twin Cities. And fast forward about 20 years or more, and I'm listening to a presentation from someone from the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency talking about the spread of PFAS in the West Metro. And it turns out that one of the places where there was this rapid development in these watersheds that we were concerned about trout streams also happened to be a dumping ground for the 3M manufacturing facilities where they were creating these compounds. And now we can see this plume of spread of pollution going across the eastern Twin Cities metro area. And it's really a tragic story about trade-offs and about unintended consequences and about what we don't know. And, you know, and I don't know what to kind of do about it now. So I'm hoping Randy has an answer. But I think it's increasingly a concern about the things that we are putting on and in our landscape, and, you know, how water flows and understanding all of that, and how do we protect people. So no other words of wisdom there, but just a story.
Well, there is a trade-off with watershed rules. There typically is, you have to abstract the first half inch to a 1 inch rain for most new developments. So that generally means infiltration. So in areas, this is residential development, maybe they're not putting a lot of salt down, but you go to Home Depot and you're putting you see people buying bags of fertilizer and pesticides. That's going somewhere. So it's probably going in the groundwater. And so how quickly are we contaminating that, and how quickly are we getting ahead of what the water treatment plants can actually treat and keep us safe? So it's a real trade-off in that. Salt is kind of the biggest one that in my career, I just don't know how to solve that. There is such a safety issue with it. We get such pushback from highway departments, residents saying that we've had it happen. Even in the middle of a snowstorm, they want to be able to drive the posted speed limit. So that's what Public Works is responding to. And Public Works now has a lot of technology to put salt down early. I mean, at a less rate because it's a brine condition, but still it's salt. And it doesn't take much to see an impact on the receiving water body. So I guess that's future work for engineers and watershed administrators and Public Works people to figure out, how do we balance public safety with water quality and specifically with salt?
I think just jumping onto that, or continuing with the salt use at our watershed district, we're starting to implement grants for chloride reduction. So offering funding to our cities so far it's just been public entities for chloride reduction methods. So we've had somebody come in and request grant funding for a liquid brine maker, someone installing heated sidewalks in front of a public building to reduce salt use there. So looking for those, and looking for ways to monitor that too, so to see if they are effective and worth the high cost that goes along with them. And then, increasing our monitoring too for the chlorides, looking at early ice out situations and various hotspots around the district to do that monitoring.
And I'll just add, with chlorides, there's a great opportunity for education as well. And, there's some great work that's happening in that regard, just helping people understand that more isn't better, it's just costing you more, and it's costing us more collectively in terms of the environmental impacts. So I think my understanding is that those efforts have been pretty effective in seeing some really substantial reductions in salt use.
He's been so patient.
Fat chance. So Randy Nepresh, I'm curious for everybody's opinion about what seems to be a unique opportunity. So here in Minnesota, we have this absolute treasure trove of water quality data between the watershed districts, Met Council, state agencies, assessment work. It's arguably the best on the planet. There's a group of people at the University of Minnesota who are working to just kind of try to wrap their brains around the extent of this set of data and how to use it, what it all means, et cetera, et cetera. So we got that on one hand. Then on the other hand, we have cities and watershed districts that have been putting in SCMs by the hundreds for 20 years or more, which means that we have these networks that have been in place, large numbers of SCMs, but also large numbers of different networks all around the state, long enough to have had an effect and be able to see the results in some of the receiving waters, like you talked about delisting. So now Dr. Bhaskar comes in with a metric, a tool that can be used to approximate pretty quickly and describe these networks. There were two things I loved about your presentation, more than that, obviously, but use of the word assemblages, which is great. It makes it sound like a fish study.
Yes.
But also the chart where you showed the descriptions of the different mixes of stormwater networks, these assemblages of SCMs. So we have this opportunity to apply this tool to a large number of combinations of networks and receiving waters where we have data and begin to assess what works and what doesn't, and what works under some circumstances, what doesn't in others. It seems like a remarkable opportunity. You listening, John? And so I'm curious about your opinion as to whether this is as big a deal as I think it is.
Yeah. Yeah, let's go. Well, and you know where I thought you were going to go, Randy, was like, let's get the AI involved, and we could probably pretty rapidly start to, and that, that's one of the things we've been talking about at the state too, is we've got all of this data. How can we make better use of it to really inform ourselves about what works and what doesn't work? And that I think is the big opportunity, John. Just making a to-do list for the Stormwater Center. Yeah, it would be awesome.
Any other thoughts?
I mean, yeah, I agree. It's a great opportunity. We keep track, of our BMP installation, a lot of other data that goes along with that. We also collect that for most of our cities too, if they install things that maybe didn't go through a permit or grant. We try to share that. It doesn't always happen, but we do try to keep that in one central database. One thing I noted when you were talking about the naming structures, I know when we created a new database, we had that just on our small level, the naming issue. We had, rain garden is one word, rain garden is two words, filtration, biofiltration, and trying to standardize that. But I think we got there, so it would be good to, share with others.
Is stormwater one word?
Right, yeah, that too.
I'm dying to know, is it one or two?
I think it'd be a fantastic way to go because in one watershed I work with, Coon Creek, they have a GIS database. They've got a lot of all the BMPs, rain gardens, trenches, you name it. So there's watersheds that have that, and they have it where it's located. It's on GIS. So, and they've got water quality data to go with it. So it'd be interesting to look at those watersheds if you have 55% rain gardens, 20% stormwater ponds, X like that, and you have this water quality outlet for this type of urban watershed. What are the results? And now you can kind of normalize it across, at least in our case, the metro area where I primarily work.
And this is one of the reasons why I wanted to talk about this to this audience, because I, in addition to building on some previous University of Minnesota work, because I thought this setting would be a good case study. And I thought, and hearing about all the extent of the data here, it's even more so. It's a kind of tremendous treasure trove of the water quality and the outcome end, and then the SEM data, and kind of pairing those together would be just tremendous to see, like, how is it working and what can we learn?
Cool, let's do it.
I'm going to ask a question, then we'll go back to our online audience. So following on to that and talking about what we've talked about, it all leads to how we might make better decisions, right? How do we make changes in what we're doing to better get towards the goals we're trying to achieve? And so the question I want to think about right now, because obviously we're making those decisions. So how do we prioritize today where we might implement SCMs or capital improvement projects or different changes in our urban landscapes to pursue those goals? What are we doing today for prioritization? And then maybe once we get all the data analysis done by AI, maybe we can change how we do it. But what are we doing today to make those priority decisions?
Well, again, since you're looking at me, I'll start. Well, I mean, this is it. I think it's going to sound pretty basic, but we look at the data, and in terms of watershed planning, we look at the data. We say, where are the issues? What are the issues? Where are the issues? We do that in a public discussion. We talk about community values, and we set some priorities for where do we want to work first. So that's in a really large watershed scale, that Huck 8 scale that I was talking about earlier. But so then you can start to identify where do we need more information so that we can make those targeting decisions about where specifically should we be putting a particular BMP, and how do we match that issue that we have found with the exact right practice and location and timing and combination and assemblage of activities. So it needs to be a data and a public value discussion.
So on the installation side, we get down to some watershed assessments. So we have the overall watershed has its monitoring plan and identifies stream reaches or ditches that the water quality is terrible. So now you pull out that 10, 20 square miles or sometimes a lot less, and you look in that area and say, okay, now let's have another couple of years of real in-depth monitored water quality data out of this area, and hope it rains. And we actually have something to measure and say, okay, now as we can define this further, where are our problem sources? So then we get that done, and then it's sitting down and figure out, okay, what kind of practices can we do here to target those problems? Sometimes it's stream stabilization, sometimes it's ponds, sometimes it's just waiting for a land to go from ag to urban, because it would now be up to current water quality runoff standards in theory for the discharge. So, and then now it's funding those and going 20 years. You know, so it takes a while, but that's the process we've been going through.
I think for us, prioritization is a big discussion, and we have, all watershed districts have a 10-year watershed management plan that identify project goals and potential projects that can be implemented. We also have developed several different prioritization tools, so looking for ways to assess potential project sites, looking at a large number of factors. So going on site and looking for, the location in the watershed. Where does it drain to? Is it in I use a social vulnerability index. So is it in a priority area where we maybe don't have a lot of projects? Looking at a large number of things, and then scoring those projects on that, and then reaching out to the property owners, and property owner interest is a huge part of that piece. And then bringing that back to our board of managers to look at, okay, we have these, 3 or 4 potential projects. This is their prioritization and owner interest, and then moving forward from there.
And I'll comment from the Denver perspective. There's a lot of new development going on in the Denver suburbs, and that's, I see, really kind of an opportunity to not get into building the same way we have and then dealing with the stormwater impacts afterwards, and trying to retrofit and trying to figure out where we can fit things in and getting homeowners to agree, but really saying, how can we really go what's considered now above and beyond, but in the future might just be kind of the minimum, but to, have development done really, and, low impact development plus, and, for that new development. So we don't, just because it's so much more challenging once it's already built to deal with the problem.
That's great. So if I can summarize what I heard, data was one piece. Community and social aspects was another big piece. Sometimes gathering more information is another piece. And then really identifying the goals, right? So those are kind of 4 big pieces on how we make our decisions, and take advantage of opportunities then. Looking for those opportunities, I think, is another piece. Maybe that's a 5th one. So let's take another question online. I think that's our next one.
We have a question here asking, what is the balance between water quality improvement with SCMs and stormwater flood management to reduce property damage? Up to what size WCMs do these 2 need to work together?
Go ahead. In my experience, flooding always takes the upper hand. That's where an immediate project's got to come in and deal with the flooding issue. Water quality is such a long-term thing. Really, if you push something off a year or 2, who's going to know, really? But if you have flooding in the next year, a lot of people know. So flooding gets the immediate response.
Other thoughts? Nobody wants to touch that one?
Well, I mean, it's a matter of trade-offs again, but I think I agree with Ed that, that flooding is more of an emergency sort of condition, and if there are projects that you can do to mitigate flooding and improve water quality, so much the better.
Exactly. Yeah. It's a balance, right? You want to take those opportunities where you can. Build in multiple benefits.
Right.
The thing is, for water quality, we're typically dealing with events that are on, or measure like a 1/2 inch to 1 inch storm. Right. Whereas a flood issue is looking at 5 to 8 inches of rainfall. So they're really different things to get at the same time.
And I think it's important to recognize that those are different goals, and your one SCM doesn't have to do both, right? We can use different tools for different goals. So we can't always expect too much out of one thing. If we can get it, that's great. But sometimes we want to use the best tool available for what the goal is.
one more sort of big picture reflection that I'll make on that is, just this idea of watershed work where we're trying to think about upstream versus downstream kind of relationships. And, that's one of the things that we're doing in Minnesota with our watershed planning approach. We're trying to get local governments, the watershed districts, the counties, the soil and water conservation districts, the municipalities, talking to each other about what's happening upstream and downstream. And that's how watershed districts came to be in Minnesota in the first place, was the flooding concerns, like, hey, what you're doing upstream is sending water downstream and impacting me. And, so now we're able to have those conversations in a bigger, more robust way around, many more watershed land and water management issues. So, for what it's worth.
No, that's great. And I think that's absolutely one of our biggest challenges is the disconnect between upstream and downstream. Yep. Where we do treatment and where the receiving water bodies are, and communities upstream and downstream. That's one of our biggest challenges for sure. And it actually segues really well into our closing question. We're going to do our closing question now, where I ask for key takeaways from all of our panelists. What I'd like them to do is comment on, what would you like to re-highlight from what we've said today that you want to re-emphasize for our audience, or if there's something that maybe we didn't get to cover but you think is really important to this conversation, feel free to share that. But we're going to do our key takeaways in the same order that we introduced everybody. So I'm going to start on the far end, my right, your left, with Julie Westerlund. What are your key takeaways for us today?
So I'm just intrigued by this notion of an index that can help us understand how watersheds behave, and how what we do to, both change the landscape and then mitigate the effects of those changes, how we can better understand that. So, that's what I'm going to walk away with, is that concept. And, how do we use that data to make better decisions? So I really appreciate the work that's being done to do that on a very small scale. And I'd like us to think about how we do that on a bigger scale. And then how do you visualize that and tell this story?
That's great, Julie. Ed, your key takeaways.
I'm intrigued by taking the 50 years of data that we've got through these multiple watersheds and applying this technique on it to see what assemblage of best management practices, SCMs, are potentially the right fit. Maybe what would be nothing, but it'd be really interesting to see what that analysis would tell us. I'm sure it'd tell us some interesting things.
Absolutely, and I think it might tell us that we're still missing some information, right? There might be variables we're not accounting for so far. Thanks, Ed. Paige, what would be your key takeaways?
So I had the same takeaway, sharing data. So John, you're going to be busy, I guess. And yeah, just building off each other. I think small scale, we work really well together with our agencies, but yeah, looking at that at a broader scope. And I liked what you said, Andy, about different tools for different goals. So making sure that we're selecting the right tool for each goal.
That's wonderful. And Dr. Bhaskar gets our final word. What would be your key takeaways for us today?
Yeah, it was great to hear about, some of the, maybe I can call them limitations, or what's not captured by, the maintenance aspect and all the different potential applications of what I was presenting to, lakes and wetlands and all the work that maybe is yet to be incorporated, and applying it at different scales. Even more broadly, I have lots to take back to the Denver area in terms of what I've learned from what all you are doing in Minnesota, and want to, stay connected and involved in the SEM and analysis and with you all. So yeah, thanks.
That's great, and that's the goal here, is to share information. So we've learned a lot from you, and thankfully you've learned some from us, and we can all continue to work together towards better decision making, right, in the future. So that'll conclude our Minnesota Stormwater Seminar Series event for today. I want to thank our keynote speaker, Aditi Bhaskar, for setting the keynote. I want to thank our panelists for sitting on the panel and answering your questions. I want to thank the audience for joining us both in person and online to give us those questions. And share with us your needs and concerns with what we're talking about with watersheds and green infrastructure and stormwater. I encourage you all to tune in for a future seminar series, and I hope you have a great rest of your day. Please help me thank our keynote and panelists.